has there been any engagement between the open source community and, let's say, the standardization bodies, such as the 3GPP or the IEEE, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and I think everybody recognizes that that is more and more essential, particularly as we're getting closer to 5G. We've seen pretty much all of the standards organizations happy and eager to work with open source communities, and indeed the communities are very happy and eager to work with them. In fact, it's the same people that are actually across both of these organizations. You know, it used to be the case that, like I mentioned before, a standards organization, it's kind of like the waterfall model in development, right? You've got the creation of the requirements, and then you have the actual design, and then you have the implementation, and then you have the testing qualification, and then you have the maintenance mode, right? You deploy and you go into maintenance mode. Well, standards were really done at that original requirements phase. They were flushed out from one end to the other, everybody agreed, and then the implementation, the design of what your product would look like to meet that standard would work, and that implementation then would be started to be constructed. We've learned over time that in software development, that has a lot of gaps. By the time you get to that final product, often the requirements have changed, or they weren't really specified quite well enough, right? And so there's work that needs to be done. We've also learned that software today never hits a maintenance mode. It's constantly being reconstructed, refactored, new features are being added. So in the software development world, we've done agile, right? We've moved to an agile model, very small sprints, a very small amount of work. You do that, and then you say, does this fit my need? And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, you do it again, right? And it's okay because it was a small development cycle, and so you iterate constantly. Open source is kind of like that. And agile also depends a great deal on reuse, in the sense that when you're building software, you will get through so many cycles and then recognize, I have duplicates. I have duplicate software functions now throughout my system. I want to re-architect that, combine it all into a single component, and you refactor it so that your software is efficient as you're doing these iterative processes. Again, very much in the end, often those refactored components into a common library, that often becomes open source, and it's commonly used across lots of different projects. So we have the marrying of open source, get something out quickly, iterate, and as we get solid on what the interoperability should be through that creation of that software, then we go behind and actually implement standards to solidify that work so that anybody, not just those that are working in that open source ecosystem, can benefit from the interoperable definitions that have been done. So the balance and the collaboration between open source efforts and the standards is starting to become more and more clear, I think, across the industry, and it kind of looks like that.
So you don't see a kind of disconnect between some of the traditional standardization bodies where they like to set things in stone and then work from there. Do you think they've actually evolved to embrace this open source model?
I do. I think they're getting there. It's recognized that it's all about getting to the innovation faster, right? And it's very important that once we get to that innovation, that indeed it all interoperates and works. And it's, in the end, it seems to be a combination between the two. And I think that's exactly what the industry is evolving to. The one gap that still exists is still trying to figure out the intellectual property regimes between the two, and that's still a gap that everybody's working on. Right? The standards bodies have always had a way of implementing patents, essential patents that are part of a given activity and a given standard, with rights for licensing to everybody else, and that's all part of it. Where open source, because of the nature of needing to be able to use that software in a variety of different contexts, its model has typically been there is a licensing regime, most definitely, but it's pretty much always a free licensing regime.
I guess the last question would be, what's next for the Linux Foundation? Where do you see that going?
Well, the Linux Foundation, again, starting probably about 5 years ago, just had different different groups, different companies coming to us saying, we see the success of Linux. We see how that has allowed an industry to work together and create this software that seems to be capable of doing everything from running the largest supercomputer to the phone that's in your pocket. You know, as a large set of corporate players in an industry, we recognize we need to pivot with our technology, and we would like help doing that together. So the Linux Foundation is really gearing itself to be able to help industries do that. The telecom industry is a good example, and yes, we have lots of different open source projects in networking because there's a lot of enthusiasm. They see the value in doing that, and we're in the middle of learning, right? We want whatever is wherever there's interest, we want to be able to facilitate it. But at the same time, as we get to a certain point, we recognize fragmentation is not particularly helpful. So helping projects consolidate back down to become as efficient as possible is part of the life cycle. And again, networking has been something that has had a lot of activity, activities around blockchain, and doing that type of activity is another industry fundamental as far as being able to do secure transactions. That's got the potential for being very fundamentally impactful across a variety of industries. A lot of work going on at the Linux Foundation there. Obviously, containers are very significant, so there's a lot of container activity. So wherever different organizations feel as though collaborating together across an industry is helpful to allow that industry to innovate as quickly as possible, they come to the Linux Foundation, and the Linux Foundation is gearing itself to be able to help them.
Great. Thank you very much, Phil.
Sure.